Greetings, friends, and welcome back to my channel. I am the GM Philosopher, and today we are talking about handling gods, deities, and religion in your D&D game, okay? I have to give a shout out, and I hope I get this name right, to Mikkel6938, who basically said in one of their comments, with all that talk of gods and fallen angels, I'm tempted to ask you if you have a video coming on how to handle these beings in a campaign setting. And the answer is yes, absolutely. And I went ahead today and decided to film this video. Now, I'm going to try to keep this as short and as concise as I can. I'm going to try to move through this very quickly because I could talk at great length about this. I don't want to make this video too long, though. So let's jump right into it. I'm going to give you 6 rules that govern how I run gods and religion in my campaigns. I'm going to give you 3 must-dos that players have to meet, like criteria they have to meet before they really get to interact with gods at all. And I'm going to give you my final rule about how I run the relationship between gods and mortals in my campaign across the board as a final say in what happens and what doesn't. But one thing I will say is that final rule that I'm going to give you at the end is really the big one. And so I want you to stay tuned as I go through all of these. But you have to kind of understand these 6 smaller rules and then the 3 criteria before we get into there. Okay, let's jump into it. Rule number 1. The gods don't care about most mortals by default. The gods may care about mortals as a whole. They may smile upon the idea of the little children and the mothers and the church of believers, etc. But for the most part, they don't care much about individual mortals. This is how I treat gods in D&D. Rule number 2, the gods only care about exceptional mortals who catch their eye for some reason. In other words, this is like a requirement. Gods may care about the collective of their followers. They don't really care about the individuals. They do, however, care about some individuals, and those individuals, for some reason, stand out as exceptional, and that's what makes the gods take notice of them. Rule number 3. The gods really only interact with mortals in the context of getting what they want, aside from the occasional act of benevolence. The gods really only make deals or arrangements that benefit them in some way and are generally inherently selfish and are driven primarily by their own preservationist instincts. So this is true even of the good gods. They may do the occasional benevolent thing, right? But for the most part, they're driven by their desire to succeed, to maintain their place as a god, to maintain their position of power, and to maintain more influence than the other gods, because the other gods are their peers, and it's sort of like a big cosmic game they play, with the mortals being the chess pieces. With that being said, I have run many successful D&D games where it has been very, very religious. A lot of my games tend to lean toward being very religiously centered. The gods end up playing a big role in it, and the players end up worshiping the gods, and those acts of worship, that lifestyle of religion, religious fervor, becomes a really central component to many of my games. And the reason for that is because you can make it so much fun. But this is how I balance it out. Okay, now let's go to rule number 4. The gods enjoy being approached by exceptional PCs who may, either in practice or even in potential, have something of value to offer them. This strokes the gods' egos, and they may be inclined to at least dip a toe into an arrangement with such mortals. In other words, in order for a character to be exceptional to the gods, they have to have something to offer. That something can be potential for the future, like potential of great power, very talented, many gifts, etc. Someone who could help the god in the future, the god may invest in them. Rule number 5. The gods are actually sort of limited to how they're supposed to interact with the mortal world due to their deals and dealings with other gods. And thus, mortals can and often are useful as agents to help gods accomplish things that they may otherwise not be able to accomplish. I had a campaign where there was this being who had the ability to travel through time. And at first it was sporadic. He didn't know how to do it, but he got better at it and better at it. And what eventually ended up happening was he ended up living his life over and over and over again. He would retain his knowledge, but he'd go back and keep living it over and over again. His time travel wasn't so much that he literally moved around in time, but it was that his consciousness could return or move to different points in time, and he would pick up where it was, but he could kind of visit himself along the timeline. And the problem was that he became incredibly educated. He became a master of magic, of all schools of magic. He became basically like the most potent wizard and strategist of all time. And his end goal was to become omniscient, omnipresent, to ascend to the realm of gods, to defeat all the other gods in combat and become the one supreme ruler of all reality, basically, like of all timelines, of all realities, to become the one and only. So he was like this big bad. But the problem was, all the gods were a little worried about him, but they didn't want to let the other gods roam free in the mortal world and start dipping their toes too much into the affairs in the world. So rather than, like, they all didn't trust each other. So rather than let each other go to the mortal world and fix it, they chose champions from amongst mortals, and they gave them the mission to hunt him down and stop him. Hence, the players in the group were all chosen as champions of the gods, and they were called God touched, and they had these like abilities that came with it, and they developed these intimate relationships with the gods, who the gods were basically saying, we need you to solve this for us because we're kind of at a standstill. If we do the wrong thing, war will break out in the realm of gods, and that'll just distract us more from what's going on. See, so there's like a bunch of bureaucratic nonsense that goes on. So that's a rule that I always observe in my campaigns when it comes to gods. And then rule number 6, serving one god is likely going to be a completely different experience than serving another, depending on the gods being served and on how their domains, desires, beliefs, and core principles differ. Now, I'm going to give you an example of this. This is from the 3rd edition handbook, Player's Handbook. And there's a basic description of the gods of Greyhawk in this. And I'm going to give you 2 good examples. Serving, and these are examples of how serving one god may be a very different experience than serving another. Let's take, for example, Nerul. Nerul, according to 3rd edition D&D Player's Handbook, is the god of death. He's neutral evil. He is known as the Reaper, the foe of all good, hater of life, bringer of darkness, king of all gloom, and reaper of flesh. Nerul is the patron of those who seek the greatest evil for their own enjoyment or gain. The domains he is associated with are death, evil, and trickery. His worshippers, who include evil necromancers and rogues, depict him in an almost skeletal cloaked figure who bears a scythe, his favorite weapon. Now, that experience of serving that god is going to be much different than the experience of serving, for example, Hieronius. The god of valor, Hieronius, is lawful good. His title is the Invincible. Hieronius promotes justice, valor, chivalry, and honor. The domains he is associated with are good, law, and war. His favorite weapon is the long sword, and he is worshipped by paladins, good fighters, and good monks. His archenemy is Hextor, his half-brother, who is the god of the orcs. But anyway, so serving Hieronius and serving Nerul are 2 completely different things. If you serve Nerul, like, there's a very high likelihood that if you start to get his attention, he will want to kill you for his own pleasure. He'll want to trick you into some wild way of helping him, and then he will want to torture you and just eliminate you in a painful and terrible, dark way just to enjoy himself. And the fact that you were exceptional to him was what made you stand out and made him want to bring pain and death to you, right? There's a very real danger of that. How do you avoid that with Nerul? You have to prove that you're so valuable that he actually needs you so much, or you bring so much pleasure to him in some other way that leaving you alive is literally beneficial. It's not really about principles. He's a god of trickery and murder, right? So these are his domains. This is what he encapsulates. Now, Hieronius is different. Those who serve Hieronius can expect to be treated in the ways that Hieronius believes in. He promotes justice, valor, chivalry, and honor. So if you catch his attention, he's more likely to take you under his wing and bring you up in those principles and to reward you for doing them well, though he would be more likely to punish you harshly if you do not abide by them, right? But these are 2 very different experiences, and the expectations that come with them are very different. And I have had players worship Nerul and worship Hieronius be in the same party. And let me tell you something. There was more player on player fighting in that game than in ever. That was in the original game I was talking about, where the gods had champions, because the one who served Hieronius was always praying to Hieronius and wanting to be honorable. They wanted to be chivalrous. They wanted to have valor. But then the ones who served Nerul, basically, they were sneaking out at night and for pleasure, seeking out weaker victims to murder and just for no other reason than for the enjoyment of the kill, literally like serial killers. Okay. So obviously, these two were at odds when they discovered their true motives and stuff like that. And if it weren't for the central theme of their gods needed them to defeat this enemy, they probably would have just killed each other. But there had to be like a truce between them, in that if they did fight each other and they, killed each other, or they died in the process, they would let their gods down. And that would be bad, because then when they go to the afterlife, they have to face those gods. And so it's like there's a lot of weight to it. Okay. Now let's move on and talk about the 3 criteria that I usually use for players interacting with gods. Okay. Number 1, they must show that they're truly exceptional through either adventuring, succeeding, showing great strength or courage, showing that fate smiles upon them, or that they're likely to have a significant destiny, etc. They have to catch the god's eye somehow. I had one game where there was a player, so they ended up catching the attention of a character of the god Hextor, and they were actually a catfolk rogue. Okay, so it was a little different. They were like basically a humanoid cat, and they were a rogue. They were unarmed combatants, so they had claws, but Hextor is the god of tyranny, is lawful evil. His titles are Champion of Evil, Herald of Hell, and Scourge of Battle. Hextor is the 6-armed god of war, conflict, and destruction. Hextor's worshippers include evil fighters and monks, and his favored weapon is the flail. The domains he's associated with are destruction, evil, law, and war. He sends his followers to commit evil, and their special purpose is to overthrow the followers of Hieronius wherever they are found. Hieronius is Hextor's half-brother. So I had a monk who wasn't religious at all. Not at all. Actually, they were very chaotic neutral, and they just did a bunch of crazy stuff. They would get into bar fights. Sometimes they would help people. Sometimes they would just be a murder hobo. However, there was this one situation where they came across a temple of Hextor on their journey, and they stopped in and talked to the priest, and they ended up getting a little quest from the priest, and they did the quest. And through this, they ended up praying to Hextor, and they heard a bit of a return. Hextor did speak a few words to their subconscious, and this had left an impact on the monk. And then the monk went on to fight in a battle not too long after, and ended up praying to Hextor for strength. And Hextor did bless the monk and gave the monk strength, and then they went on to actually do quite a lot. They succeeded in the battle. And if I remember correctly, this has been a while ago, but if I remember correctly, the god even saved the monk from getting killed at one point, giving them the strength to overcome perhaps what would have been fatal odds stacked against them. And so this left a huge impression on the monk. They went back to the temple, and they basically converted to Hextorian worship. Now, this character was not an orc. This character did not wield a flail. They didn't do a lot of the traditionally religious things that this god would expect. However, and it's true that they were not inherently believers in concepts like, battle, yes, but war, yes, conflict, yes, destruction. This monk wasn't necessarily down for destruction's sake. Also, evil was not necessarily something I would have used to describe this monk. However, when the monk converted to Hextor, they began to practice Hextor's principles in a manner of worship, and this did change the character. A character who was very chaotic and all over the place suddenly became relatively lawful, relatively evil and scary, and relatively destructive and effective, especially as the relationship to Hextor grew. So what ended up happening was they actually became Hextor's champion. This was in a different campaign than the original campaign with the champions, but they did become Hextor's champion in the world at that time. There was another cosmic threat, and that was a different campaign. But this character ended up practicing Hextorian principles, and this created direction and depth for the character that was then rewarded by things like magic weapons, magic armor, other followers of Hextor who joined, and this character became somewhat of a high priest. So all kinds of interesting things happened. And that went all the way to level 20. So it was an epic level campaign. So anyway, this criteria, you have to get the god's attention, but keep in mind that means different things for different gods. Okay. Now, number 2. They must demonstrate their commitment to that god's principles. For example, and I was just my story kind of leads into this. For example, someone truly adept at murder who enjoys murder and killing is far more likely to fall under the curious gaze of Nerul than of Hieronius. That kind of character, Hieronius is going to see them as exceptional, exceptionally bad, needs to be smited. They're going to send their paladins to take them out. Nerul may see that person and be like, ooh, you're good at killing. You know what? You should go to my shrine. I'm curious. If I gave you a little quest, if you'd succeed. And if you did, would you succeed enough that I would want to leave you alive? This sounds like a fun game to me. Let's do it. Go to the shrine. They're going to send you a little message and lure you in, right? So this is two very different experiences, but demonstrating a commitment to a god's principles matter a lot to the god. Okay, so if you want any god to take you seriously, you have to demonstrate a commitment to their principles. That's one thing I have in my games. That's criteria. And then criteria number 3, they must show that for at least the most part, they are committed to being more steadfast in their religious activities and take them seriously. This could mean attending services, leading services, starting their own church or movement in the name of that God, bringing more followers into the fold, or otherwise bringing positive. Positive being a very relative term, as positive to Nerul may mean spreading fear, dread, and terror, whereas positive to Hieronius might mean helping the poor, saving someone in distress, etc. And or just in general displaying an overall commitment to that God's power and dominion over the mortal plane, as well as a willingness and ability to help that God shape their will and influence in the world. So in other words, a lot of times when players will be like, I want to pray to God. Okay, pray. They pray. Nothing happens. Most of the time, nothing happens until they get to much higher levels. It's like, and I've had players in the past in games where some players were getting help from gods. Gods were showing them attention. They were getting answers to their prayers. They were even getting blessings from the gods. And then other players weren't. And then those players would say to me as a GM to be like, why do the gods seem to love him so much and not me? And the answer is, well, his character is showing that they're exceptional. You're exceptional too, but that's the first criteria. Number 2, they're demonstrating their commitment to some specific principles of the God they're praying to. They're actually demonstrating that they believe in those principles, right? And that's important. And then 3, they're showing a commitment to kind of a religious steadfastness. They're literally like, when they go to a new city, the first thing they do is they visit the temple. The first thing they do is they track down the local priest. The first thing they do is they build a shrine in this God's name out in the orchard, right? One of the first things, like the character I talked about, the monk who followed Hextor, one of the first things they would do anytime they entered a new place is actually, they would like go into some empty part of the city or village, and they would build a shrine and pray, and they would desecrate the area in the name of Hextor, and it would become kind of like a haunted, terrible place in that place, and they would leave these everywhere they went. I've also had characters literally at higher levels get so serious about this that they would, whenever they would visit a place, if the local temple didn't serve their god, they would literally command their soldiers to tear it down, and they would build a new shrine to their god. They would literally claim the temple for their own god, and then it would become this thing. If it was an evil god, if it was a good god, they usually would be more tolerant, but the evil god's very much less tolerant, as it seems to be. So, so the characters are going to demonstrate, and through their demonstrations, they're going to increase their odds of getting a god's attention. And this is how I run it in my games, and this is how I've always run it. And it's just a religious arc. Some characters have a religious arc, some don't really care. Some only pray once in a while, but there are some who are deeply religious, and so that matters to the mechanics of the game for me. And that's how I run it as such. Because the gods aren't just willy-nilly just bestowing blessings on people. You can even be a cleric, pray, get your spells, and not be inherently deeply religious. Because a cleric getting spells is a very baseline level of worship. It's not incredibly deep. It's just deep enough to get your spells. It's just deep enough to be a cleric of that god, but you could be exceptionally devout, and you could take it to a much, much deeper level even, right? So those are different things. And now we come to my final rule. When gods do invest in exceptional characters, that investment is always small and filled with small tests, trials, and tribulations first to test the faith and commitment of the character. One of the first things I do when characters start to try to worship a god and they actually manage to get that god's attention is that god gives them a quest, gives them a mission, tells them they want something, right? Right now in the game I'm running, one of the characters just started worshiping this god there's like there's like an ancient fire elemental on this island who lives inside a volcano, and they're the god of the island, right? And there's a character who was trying to worship this god, and they did manage to pray and commune with the god, and the god basically said there was like an embassy of dragonborn industrialists on the island, and this god, it was their wish for the island to be protected from industry. They didn't want it mined and the precious resources extracted. That's what the dragonborn were trying to do. So this god said, bring me the headdress of one of their dragonborn and cast it into the lava, and this will prove to me that you are committed enough in my island and my beliefs to move forward with any more talk of worship. Anyway, and not a head even, but a headdress. To get the headdress of one of these dragonborn who worship this monotheistic ancient red dragon religion, is very evangelical, very destructive and tyrannical. But to take their headdress would be like an act of like defilement. You would pretty much be guaranteed to get in a fight, or you'd have to be very skillful in stealthily stealing it while they were sleeping or something. It would be hard to get this. So this was a pretty big test. And the character actually ended up dying in the process, but they are deepening their relationship to the god in the volcano through that commitment. They literally gave their life to try to do it, and they're now floating around as a ghost. And actually, when they helped rid the island, we just had this cataclysmic battle, conclusionary battle. It was also slightly cataclysmic, but needless to say, the god rewarded this character by resurrecting their body, bringing them back to life, right? So there is a lot of depth to these things, right? But as the character progresses through these tests, tasks, trials, etc., they also gain more gifts, power, influence, and also connection to their deity and god. They can even, over the course of a campaign, go from being perhaps at level 1, the lowest form of initiate, to being the favorite mortal of that god by the time they reach levels 15 to 20-ish, usually more toward the 20. But it does take time and commitment, and they must prove their value, and they must demonstrate their faith over time. And so this is how I run the gods in my game. And basically, gods just don't really get involved with you unless you get their attention, and then either it's going to be real good or real bad. And it depends how you role play it, whether it's good or bad in that sense, in that respect. So there you go. There is my whole process and kind of how I run gods, how I run religion in my D&D games. I used to run the gods from 3rd edition, and I really like that Pantheon. I think it's super fun and super cool, but I have played it so much that I've gotten into different things. Right now in the game I'm playing, I have a new thing where I've created there are 5 major continents in the world, and every continent has its own pantheon of gods who are more powerful and influential on that continent. And so when you go to different continents, the power of the gods changes and differs because those continents are the territories of certain pantheons of gods. And so that's kind of how we're running it. And it's super cool, super fun. And it's fun to have kind of a new pantheon of gods, group of gods, like for the players to interact with and learn about and to find sacred texts of and all kinds of different things like that. So anyway, super, super cool. I love it. Hey, thank you so much for stopping by. I'm here every single day creating videos about the best game in the world, D&D, to help you have more fun playing D&D. So get out there and play some D&D. Go join a group. Go start a group. Play with your friends, play some D&D this week or this weekend, and create some intellectual art. Make your life better, because D&D is super fun for creating community, making friendships, and having some awesome fantasy shenanigans going on, which is super cool. Hit that like button and that subscribe button. Please come back and watch more of my videos. Thank you so much. I will see you on the next one.